We have already at one point talked about how really young people can learn. What was an example of that?
The reflex.
Reflexes are not learned. By definition, they are genetically hardwired in. Yeah. Yeah. That newborns will cry in the tonal language of the mom. Okay? And that is not hardwired in. So we can demonstrate that learning can occur. Can we demonstrate that even more fancy learning can occur? And the answer to that is yes, we can. This is done often with a study called visual habituation. Okay, visual habituation. This is a great learning paradigm for nonverbal children. When you go home for Thanksgiving break, if you have a nonverbal child that somehow you're going to interact with, a cousin or an Easter nephew or whatever, do this. It'll probably work. It's an experiment that will probably work. Essentially, all you do is you have two objects. And you want to make them distinctive objects, okay? Two different stuffed toys. It would be better if the child was not familiar with them, okay? Not their. In fact, that's probably critical, that they're not familiar with the objects. They're novel objects, okay? And when this is done in the laboratory, someone, caregiver brings child in. Child can't talk, so it's 1.5 years old, something before speech is really developed. And you sit there with the child, and the experimenter will show the child one of the objects, one of the novel objects, and the child will look at it. You show the child the object for like 30 seconds. Now you don't let the child touch it, play with it, slobber on it. Nothing that age of a child likes to do. Just look at it. They can look away if they want, but you just hold it in front of them. And then you hide that object. And after a period of time, 30 seconds to a minute, you show the child the object it's seen already and a brand new object. So you show the child now an object that's already seen and a brand new object. And you let it look at the two objects. You just hold them disparate so you can tell where the child's looking. You let the child look at the two objects for 30 seconds. If the child does not remember which object it saw first, on average, how much time will it spend looking at the two objects? Yes!
50-50.
What do you mean by that? You're right, but just be more right. Huh?
Like, it'll look at both about the same amount of time.
Excellent. If it does not remember which object it has already seen, it'll look at each one about the same amount of time. So if the test period is 30 seconds long, how long will it look at the old object? 15 seconds. How long will it look at the new object? 15 seconds. It's showing you no preference whatsoever. However, what the nonverbal child will do is it will spend a disproportionate amount of time looking at the new object. It remembers the old object. I've seen that one before. It's not new. Let me look at the new one. So the child can demonstrate to you, based on where it's looking, that it does indeed have learning and memory. Learning and memory is occurring. In some ways, you can almost say that's a form of declarative memory. They're not saying, oh yeah, I've seen that one before, but their behavior is declaring that they have seen and remember the previous object. All right? So you can see quite dramatic learning in nonverbal newborns in this particular case. As I said earlier, one of the struggles that we have in development is, do we look at it in the stages or a continuum? I'm going to switch and start talking about stuff in stages. Forgive me for that. Just because it's easier in some ways to break it down that way, okay? So, when we think about development, we can look at stuff often in stages. If we look at infancy and very young childhood, what we're usually focused on here is maturation. We're focused on transition. We're focused on changes. Remember, the other thing we talked about was development could be looked at in terms of stability. Isn't it an amazing thing to stable for a long period of time? Or changes. Isn't it interesting that things are changing as we go? At very young ages, we look at things in terms of maturation. And we're often interested in the biological process that underlies the development and the cognitive changes. Early on, brain is continuing to develop tremendously. You're born without a fully developed brain. In fact, the brain, the last part of the brain to develop, the prefrontal cortex, doesn't happen until somewhere between 18 and 21 years of age. Okay? We'll get to that in a little bit. So that's happening. Also, at this point in time, get profound development in motor movement. You know, right after birth, the baby can't do anything but lay there and vomit and other biological functions. Within a few months, it's starting to be able to control itself a little bit more and reach for things. And then it starts doing all other kinds of stuff. And that's seen here. Now, when you have a newborn or you work with a newborn, recall, I don't know why these didn't perfectly line up. That just shows you I'm not very good with the tap function. One of the things that we said was a doc will look at the existence of reflexes early on. The grasping reflex, the suckle reflex, the Babinski reflex, that kind of stuff. To assess if neurological development is happening correctly at the very beginning of life. As the child progresses along, they will look for these particular motoric hallmarks to make sure that everything is continuing to develop as it goes. You're not going to take a CAT scan or an fMRI or anything like that of a newborn if you don't have any reason to. So the doctor's just looking at these and seeing if they're developing correctly. What you see in this column is usually the time by which it has happened, and what you see over here is about the earliest that it, or the range that it could happen in. So the head is erect and steady when held upright. If you hold a newborn, you got to hold the head because the neurons have not grown down through the neck to innervate the muscles in the neck yet. So the baby doesn't have control of its head, and it's just flopping all over the place. On average, that happens about 6 weeks after birth. But it can go anywhere from 3 weeks to 4 months. The doc is not going to start questioning things unless it goes beyond longer than 4 months for that to develop. It's just something, some individuals takes time. And you can see the development of how things go. Lifts itself, rolls on from its side to its back. For parents, this is all fun, great stuff to watch. Okay? It can grasp stuff, can roll the other direction. It's harder to go from your back to your side. Okay? Because the child has to learn to bridge its neck so that it can use its head as a pivot. Can set alone. This is a lot of fun because until they do that, you hold them up and they wobble for a minute and then fall over. Okay? Once they start crawling, your life is over. Okay? Once the child can start doing that, life starts going downhill quickly. And that usually happens at, about 7 months. Then they pull themselves up and suddenly they want to grab everything. Yeah. Can stand alone. Once they can start walking, the next 26 years are long. It's just, they do all of these things. Jumps in place. Obviously, your child's not an elephant, because elephants can't jump. So that's always good to know. So this is just, the age at which that stuff typically develops. And that's student just development of the nervous system and the muscular system, okay? And the doctor will be really fascinated with that. I said that visual habituation is similar in some ways to declarative memory. It's like the organism's behavior is declaring to you what it knows. I'll be candid with you, I'm in a minority in that belief, okay? Most people, for declarative memory, think that the individual has to actually be able to declare it, okay? So keep that in mind, but I'm okay with it. You're in my class, so please be okay with it. You can disagree with me on December 16th. Okay, when it comes, though, to declarative memory, one of the things that's quite fascinating is the concept of infantile amnesia. You really don't remember anything before 3 years of age. Now, now, some of you may be like, oh no, I do. And I'm telling you, oh no, you don't. Okay? What you do know is stories that have been told to you a lot, and you've incorporated those into your memory. Okay? Things that happen to us typically before somewhere between 3 and 4 years of age, we just really don't remember them. Why is that? The hippocampus is developing during this time. And I'm not saying that a child that's 2 years old does not have declarative memory, because it will show you declarative memory. Okay? It will show at that point that it is remembering events in a declarative memory fashion. What happens? Remember when we talked about learning and memory, we talked about learning or encoding, storage, and retrieval? Prior to full hippocampal development, that information is encoded and stored, but it's stored in such a way that once the hippocampus is developed, it's no longer retrievable. Let's go back to the computer analogy. It's like a very bad iOS update, where suddenly the hippocampus has now come online, and the operating system no longer can retrieve that information which was stored. It's still there, you just can't get to it anymore. So because you can't get to it, you can't use it. And it's functional amnesia, which is existent in an infantile stage. You can see this in rats. I'm not going to go through it, but you'll see a developmental shift in the type of memory a rat will use at about postnatal day 23. Come in and test the animal on postnatal day 24, and it'll behave completely different. Why? Because that's the day at which the hippocampus is essentially fully developed in a rat and is now online. So the animal's brain is working completely different in those 12 to 24 hours. Okay? So most everybody, in fact, everybody will suffer from infantile amnesia. It may vary upon when the onset is of it, but it's usually around 3 to 4 years of age. So far what we've looked at is mostly motor development, a little memory development. So let's stay on cognition and cognitive development. If you take more classes in developmental psychology, okay? So in psych, that would be psych 230, lifespan, I forget what we call lifespan development. We have an adolescent class, an adult class, and an age class. So you can take a lot of classes in developmental psychology. We're in fact hiring for you developmental psychology, so that'll be fun. One of the names you run across is a psychological researcher named Piaget. Very influential in this field. And Piaget essentially broke down cognitive development in a variety of stages, okay, based on what's going on at that particular point in time. And this is based on age. The first stage is the sensory motor stage. The individual, this is an infant, is experiencing the world through their senses. Is experiencing and learning about the world through its senses. Touching. What's a newborn do? It puts everything in its mouth. Tasting stuff, feeling stuff. And that's primarily how you're learning about the world and your cognition is developing. It's lacking object permanence. Now, object permanence is one of those things that is actually changing here a little bit. You know, remember, object permanence is that you show a kid something and then you hide it, and in the child's mind, it no longer exists. If it can't see it, if it can't smell it, if it can't taste it, if it can't touch it, it's no longer there. If it can't be experienced by the senses, it doesn't exist in the world. However, let's do keep in mind that this visual habituation demonstrates that's not completely true. For at least a very short period of time, the child can remember having seen something before. Okay? So it's not like it's no longer there, it's no longer existent. But, by and large, this lack of object permanence is something that does exist, okay? In it. Then you go into a pre-operational thinking stage. This is where language is learned. Logic is not so much learned here. You're developing language. So now we're in, 2 to 8-ish. You're developing language here. Logic, not so much. The world is very egocentric. The one word that every child is excellent at saying is me, mine, or I want. Everything is focused on the child. Child's world is focused on the child. A very egocentric approach to the world. Conservation, that if something is not there, it still does exist. Go to your room and get this. They can't see it, but they know what you're talking about. They can go and get it. Okay? We move into a concrete stage where logic is developed. Conservation, the idea of conservation is further understood. The importance here is the development of logic inside of this concrete stage. And then finally, this idea of the last stage, formal operations, the ability to deal with if-then and hypothetical situations. If this happened, then that's likely going to happen. What would happen if I did this? The goal of development and the goal of education is to move people into formal operations, your ability to deal with if-then and hypothetical statements, hypothetical situations. In Piaget's framework, everybody pretty much gets to concrete stages, but not everybody gains the ability to develop into a formal thinking. The people who don't develop into formal operations become politicians. If I continue to print more and more money, oh well. So anyway, not everybody develops formal operation skills. Any questions on so far in development of Piaget? We can also look at development in terms of social nature. How does an individual develop socially? One of the most common ones is attachment and stranger anxiety. Attachment's work is based a lot on Harlow's work. So let me just talk briefly about Harlow. Harry Harlow. This is work done down at Madison a few decades ago. They tried to restart it, and the animal rights activists just had a fit over it. So what Harlow did is he was trying to ask the question, how does an infant or a newborn attach? Socially attached, cognitively attached. And he was really interested in the question, which is more important? Do you attach based off of who nourishes you, provides for your needs, gives you food, substance, and that kind of stuff? Or do you attach based off of comfort? Who comforts you? Two very different things. So what Harlow did is he developed, he worked with monkeys, and what he would do is he would take a newborn and put it with a surrogate mother, where the surrogate mother was made out of wire, okay, a wire mesh, and in one half the wire mesh was covered in terry cloth robe, so the newborn could cuddle with the mother. It kind of had a monkey-looking face, and could cuddle. Terry cloth robes are warm and fuzzy. And the other surrogate mother was just a wire mesh, same frame, but didn't have the terry cloth. I mean, who wants to cuddle with wire, right? But a bottle was attached to it. So the infant could nurse or feed off the other non-comforting mother. And the question Harlow simply asked was, which one of those two surrogate mothers does the newborn primate bond with? The one that's comfortable but doesn't feed me, or the one that feeds me and isn't comfortable? And what he found was, across the board, very, very strong effect. The newborn bonds to the mother that's comforting, not to the one that feeds. Bonds to the one that's comforting, not to the one that feeds. The most famous picture would be a monkey that's cuddled up to the surrogate mom in the terry cloth robe and is leaning over, nursing off of this bottle on the other monkey. Doesn't want anything to do with that one, but needs the food. So bonds to comfort. Raises all kinds of questions, doesn't it, in terms of how we raise children. And whatnot. Imprinting. Conrad, what is his last name? Lorenz? I forget. Demonstrated that during a particular period of time, animals will imprint. Whatever happens to be moving, it assumes is the mother. And a picture was with geese, and a picture of him being followed around. Infants will imprint on what appears to be at the most comforting individual, nourishing individual at the time. Stranger anxiety often develops out of fear of what is novel. It's not that a newborn or an infant or a young child doesn't like grandma or grandpa. They just don't know grandma or grandpa. So there's anxiety about novelty associated with that. If attachment doesn't happen, results in decreased IQ scores, increased anxiety scores, and fairly strong correlations with aggression and poor social skills. So obviously, providing more than just nourishment to a newborn is critical for their continued social and cognitive development. If you have children of your own, or you raise children, one of the things that's most amazing, you'll stand back at one point in time and think to yourself, I don't know how they lived through childhood. How did I actually keep them alive? When you leave the hospital with your newborn and you drive home, that's the most terrifying moment in the world. Because it's like, I have no idea what I'm doing, and I have to keep this alive. So, if they get through that, they go into adolescence, and your life is truly over. God, man, adolescence is just a challenge. You know what the hardest thing, though, is the time between about 21 to 26, watching them start their lives. Oh my gosh. But anyway, adolescence is overwhelmed by puberty. So tons of physical development, primary and secondary sexual characteristics develop. So overwhelmed by puberty and hormones. The prefrontal cortex is still developing here. Now, where is the prefrontal cortex? The name tells us it's cortex. So that's the outer layer of the brain, right? Frontal must be toward the front. Prefrontal is the part that transitions into the frontal cortex from the parietal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is critical. Plays a role in decision making and inhibition of inappropriate behaviors or comments. Judgment and inhibition of inappropriate behaviors or comments. Also plays a role in impulse control. So when I lecture, okay, there's a variety of conversations going on in my head. The most dominant conversation is the one that is about 3 seconds, if I'm lucky, in front of what comes out of my mouth. Okay? So it's this is what you should be saying on this slide in this topic, and then it comes out. The other conversations are mostly the peanut gallery that's sitting in the stand saying, if you say this comment, it'll be funny. This would be a witty thing to say. Now, most cases, that's not true. Okay? And it's the job of my prefrontal cortex to inhibit those particular comments. So when you think of what actually comes out, you have to wonder what actually gets filtered. But anyway, in an adolescent, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. If you spend time, if you have a younger sibling, okay, all of you are probably somewhere between 18 and 20, right? So if you have a younger sibling that's 14, 15, 16, and you think back to when you were 14, 15, 16, you did some stuff which was kind of like, adults look at you and you're like, what did you do that for? I mean, that was not smart. Why did you do that? That's a parent's favorite thing to say to their adolescent. Why did you do that? Explain that to me. And the adolescent will say often, I don't know. And parents will then get angry, right? When in fact, that's a true answer. I don't know why I did that. I had this impulse and I did it. We all were there. Somehow we did not end up in jail or dead. Okay? And that's because somehow we lived long enough for our prefrontal cortex to develop and be able to say, nothing really good happens on Water Street at midnight. I think I'll go home. That's a good time to go home. All right? So it's, the pickle really should just be shut down. Okay? It should just be condemned and blown up. All right, so anyway, that's when the prefrontal cortex is developing. That is also when moral and ethical thinking develops, okay? Moral and ethical thinking. Let's be moral and ethical thinkers here and do the trolley dilemma, okay? This is you. Has anybody done these before? All right. Well, if you've done it before, just kind of hang in the background. Let those who haven't done it before experience the nightmare, which is these. This is you. Well, it doesn't look like me. Okay, I agree with that. It doesn't look like me either. My blood sugar's up and my cholesterol's up. I'm eating radishes now. Can you believe that? And Melissa was like, show me your numbers. I was like, no, I don't have to. Hypocrite, right? No. It's just, life sucks for me right now. But this is what I would look like if I wasn't you. Okay? This is you. You are one of the most unfortunate people in the world in the next few slides. Here you are. Here is a trolley. The trolley's coming down the tracks. Okay? Here are some of the dumbest people ever to be born. Why? Because they're laying on the tracks, working on them, while this trolley's coming down, and they never thought to get off the tracks. Can we just agree that's dumb people? Okay. So, here comes the trolley, they're laying on the tracks, you're standing here, and there's a lever. There's a lever right here. And based on which direction you pull the lever, determines which way the trolley goes. So if you pull the lever this way, it's going to come down this track and go thump, 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 blood everywhere. 5 pieces of blood everywhere. If you push the lever that way, the trolley comes down here and goes thump, and kills that person. Okay? You can't stop the trolley, you can't get them off the tracks. What do? How many of you don't do anything and you let these 5 people die? How many of you push the lever over and that person dies? That's what the vast majority of people will do. And granted, you're stuck in a bad situation, right? But 1 dying seems better than 5 dying. Okay, vast majority of people will say that, okay? Now, once again, life is not good for you. Alright? Because you find yourself in this similar situation with the trolley, and because you push the lever this way, these 5 stupid people lived, and they're doing it again. Okay? So you're standing on the bridge. Here comes the trolley. If you push this person off the bridge, they'll fall onto the tracks and get hit by the trolley and die. But the trolley will stop before it hits these 5. If you do not push that person off the bridge, that person lives, but these 5 die. What do? How many of you push the person off the bridge? It's a lot harder, right? Some will, some won't. Notice this situation is the same as this situation. If you're asking the question, ultimately 1 dies or 5 dies. Here it's 1 dies or 5 dies. Why does this one feel different? You're taking more action. You're an active player in that person's fate. And that seems like you're holding more responsibility. Investigations like this, questions like this, get at how does moral and ethical thinking develop? What do you do, and more importantly, why do you do that? Okay? What do you do, and more importantly, why do you do that? So that's how a lot of that kind of stuff is studied. And a lot of that develops inside of our adolescence. All right, you've lived, yay! You've made it into adulthood. Adulthood is defined mostly by stability. Your intellect is stable, your health is fairly stable, your cognitive functions are fairly stable, all of that kind of stuff. One of the things that does change during development is perspective. Your perspective on life changes, and it changes dramatically. I'll get to that in a second. There are some changes in physical nature, but not much. You're quite stable during that time. When you're moving out of adulthood, you do get changes in physical nature. My cholesterol continues to ramp up. That will happen to you, unfortunately, also. You can have changes in sexual aspects. You can have changes in digestion, just to name a few. Freud, I think, actually did a good job on this. And I'll come back to, we'll jump down to him in a minute. Let's go back up here. Phil Best is the person I did my PhD with. Phil is probably one of the smartest people I have ever met. He was this really intelligent individual. When I knew Phil was my age right now, and I was in my 20s, okay? And Phil was incredibly, I think, unhappy with life. Mostly because I think he was really struggling with, did my life and his work make any difference? Or any change? Me, I was in my 20s. I was going to win the Nobel Prize, so I just was working hard all the time. We were doing the same stuff, but had very different perspectives on what was critical and what was important. Freud worked this out in a way. I'm not a big believer in Sigmund stuff, but here I think he got it right. As you work through adulthood and you're working your way out of adulthood, you spend most of your time balancing the idea of working versus loving. And where does your satisfaction come from? Does it come from the relationships of your life? Or does it come from the work that you're doing in your life? That's one of the main things adults struggle with, is that cognitive tension of, has my life mattered or not? And it's really hard to be able to get that answer. If we live long enough, we get into old age. Dementia and Alzheimer's are two different things, although the effect of it is similar. The likelihood of you getting it increases with age. The likelihood of you getting it also increases if you misuse alcohol. So if you misuse alcohol during age, you're more likely to develop dementia or related Alzheimer's disease. These have a variety of factors that impact them, but for this class, one thing that happens is the destruction of the hippocampus. The hippocampus essentially is starting to decay away, but the person's still alive. Remember when we talked about LTP, how lined up all the cells in the hippocampus were? The CA3 cells are all lined up, the CA1 cells are all lined up. The hippocampus is very organized. In someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, the hippocampus is not organized. You get what we call neurofibrillary tangles. Instead of everything being perfectly lined up, now it looks like somebody dropped spaghetti there. And cells begin to die. And that develops what's called beta amyloid plaques. If you know someone who has Alzheimer's, it's painful. They start off with, they don't remember stuff very well, but they can cover it, they can hide it. They know there's a cognitive deficit, but they can figure ways around it so that they're able to function still, but it continues to progress along. And then they reach a point of not being able to remember people. And then they don't remember their kids. And then, if they continue to live, they'll get almost full-blown amnesia. It's a very painful, debilitating disorder. Not just for the person who has it, but for those who have to suffer through it with them. Death and dying is probably one of the most understudied areas of psychology. It's hard to get subjects to volunteer to die, right? But it is interesting. Death changes, watching somebody die changes perspective. My dad died earlier this year. He's been dead now for just over 2 months. And I still find myself shocked that he's dead. Maybe about a year or two before he died, I asked him a question which ended up being quite poignant for the last year. I asked if he was scared to die, because he was getting old. He was 77 at that point in time. The life expectancy for an American male is 78. So I said, Dad, are you scared to die? And he said, no. Actually, when you get to the end, you just get tired. And